Welcome to the Whole Counsel podcast. I'm John Snyder, and we're looking again at letters that still speak. Some of the sweetest letters written in the last 5 centuries by well-known believers who, through their correspondence, were able to encourage or guide or even at times rebuke other believers. And many of these were missionaries or pastors that were not able to be face-to-face with the people they're communicating with. And those people, recognizing the spiritual wisdom of that pastor or missionary, wrote them letters. And that's the case with letters that we've been looking at in John Newton's Cardiphonia, the book title which translated means Utterances of the Heart. This is a series of letters to a Mrs. So-and-so. He removes her name. They were actual private letters, so he removes the name so that it won't be embarrassing. Mrs. So-and-so is a believer, and we don't hear him talking to her about her husband in these letters. We don't have her letters. We kind of have to infer what the topic of conversation has been from his responses. But whether her husband has passed away or whether he's not a believer, and so he's not kind of brought into the conversation, we're not told. But these letters were written in the early days of John Newton's pastorate in Olney, a beautiful little English village just north of Cambridge area in England. And the letters we've been reading up to this point were from the earliest years, the first years, and now this letter number 4. We skipped letter 3 because letter 3 is very short, and it doesn't say anything that isn't contained in the 4th letter. So we'll just move right to letter 4, and it was actually written in 1769. And there's a number of really encouraging things from this letter and from the 5th letter that follows. I want to notice just a couple of things right at the beginning. And first is that John Newton is so very down to earth and very human. He opens the letter by saying, "I found this morning among my unanswered letters one from you. But hope I left it among them by mistake." So he's looking at his pile of letters on his desk, and he has the answered letter pile and the unanswered letter pile. And Newton is a busy young pastor, and he goes to sit down to answer letters, and he sees that her letter is in the unanswered letter pile, and it's been there a while. And he thinks that he already answered it, but he's not sure. So he goes on to say, just in case I didn't already answer this, and in case this isn't still here in the unanswered pile by mistake, I don't mind, he says, to write you another letter. And so he writes again. Another thing that I want to notice about Newton, I want us to see how wonderfully equipped Newton is to speak about hardships and illnesses. John Newton, if you've read about his conversion and the time in Africa and the extreme situation that he found himself in, imprisoned and starving and at the mercy of a woman who despised him, and he was a lost man and probably deserved some of that despising. Newton understands what it is to hit rock bottom. He understands what it is, as later his hymn says, for grace to just to tear away all the layers of self-sufficiency and self-righteousness, and for grace to teach us to fear and to drive us to Christ. His comments to those who are suffering are so beneficial. There's compassion and there's biblical comfort, but there is always the aspect in which he backs the reader up, back away from their present situation to see the big picture of God. And God's dealing with us for his glory and for our spiritual good. And so Newton's letters are never the kind of letters that just say, I'm so sorry to hear about this, poor you. Why does this always seem to happen to you? But don't worry, one day you'll get better. It's much deeper than that. And it always brings them to see the benefit of belonging to a perfect God who even allows these things and teaches us how to walk through the middle of them. Well, he's talking again about difficulties and hardships, and he mentions that in a previous letter, she told him, and then he also had some mutual friends between he and her had been traveling, and they also confirmed that she had been sick for a long time with a pretty difficult illness. But now he hears that she has recovered. And he wants to talk a little bit here about how God uses difficulties, including illnesses, for our own spiritual good. And he mentions that God would not allow these things were it not for our good. And he gives the reason why. And I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs. It's a bit of a long reading. But listen to how Newton deals with this. He says, the evil of our nature is deeply rooted and very powerful. If not, such repeated, continual corrections and chastisements would not be necessary. And were they not necessary, we should not have them. But such we are, and therefore such must be our treatment. For though the Lord loves us with a tenderness beyond what the mother feels for her nursing child, yet it is a tenderness directed by infinite wisdom, and very different from the weak indulgence which in parents we call fondness, which leads them to comply with their children's desires and inclinations rather than to act with a steady view to their true welfare. The Lord loves his children and is very indulgent to them so far as they can safely bear it, but he will not spoil them. Their sin sicknesses require medicines, some of which are very unpalatable. But when the case calls for such, no short-sighted entreaties of ours can excuse us from taking what he prepares for our good. But every dose is prepared by his own hand, and not one is administered in vain, nor is it repeated any oftener than is needful to answer the purposed end. Till then, no other hand can remove what he lays upon us, but when his merciful design is answered, he will relieve us himself, and in the meantime, he will so moderate the operation or increase our ability to bear it that we shall not be overpowered. It is true, he says, without a single exception, that all his paths are mercy and truth to them that fear him. His love is the same when he wounds as when he heals, when he takes away as when he gives. We have reason to thank him for all, but most for the severe. It's quite a paragraph, and I read the whole thing because he just says it in such a wonderful way that the indwelling sin, even in the new believer, the new creation, there are still those elements, those old clinging elements of that self-centeredness, the pride and the unbelief, the self-centeredness. And Newton says that God uses these difficult times. And unlike an earthly parent, he says, he's not just fond of us in a kind of a sentimental way that unwisely gives in to our cries, but he always does what's best for us. In spite, sometimes, Newton says, of our short-sighted pleadings with God, where we will cry out to God and say, God, if you love me, would you not get me out of this situation? And Newton says, no, he's too wise for that. Now, John Newton goes on to say that the unbeliever, the world, knows nothing of this relationship between the believer and God, between the saint and heaven. And he writes these words, how little does the world know of that intercourse which is carried on between heaven and earth? What petitions are daily presented and what answers are received at a throne of grace? Oh, the blessed privilege of prayer. Oh, the wonderful love, care, attention, and power of our great shepherd. His eye is always upon us. When our spirits are almost overwhelmed within us, he knows our path. His ear is always open to us. Let who will overlook and disappoint us, he will not. When means and hope fail, when everything looks dark upon us, when we seem to shut up on every side, when we are brought to the lowest ebb, still our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. Again, wonderful reminders that no matter how difficult the situation, no matter what believers, what close friends might disappoint us during the time of that we feel is our greatest need, and even when the means that God appoints for us to find comfort seem to be empty and unhelpful, he says, even then we can trust in the name of God. He can be trusted to bring us through the most difficult times. He can be trusted to only allow us to go through things that are best for us. And he can be trusted to supply all the strength we need to endure. Newton writes, God can so manifest himself to the soul and cause his goodness to pass before it that the hour of affliction will be the golden hour of the greatest comfort. He goes on to remind us that the unbeliever also goes through hard times, and when in dark seasons of sorrow or loss or pain or confusion, the unbeliever does not have God to lean upon and has no right to think that everything will lead to their good. So he says to the believer, we, believers, we have therefore cause for continual praise. The Lord has given us to know his name as a resting place, a hiding place, a sun and a shield. Circumstances and creatures may change, but he will be an unchangeable friend. The way is rough, but he walked it before us and is now with us in every step that we take. He writes again, he says, I'm very sorry if our friend Mr. So-and-so appears to be aiming to reconcile things that are incompatible. I am indeed afraid that he has been for some time under a decline, and as you justly observe, we meet with too many instances to teach us that they who express the warmest zeal at their first setting out do not always prove the most steady and thriving afterwards. Yet I am willing to hope in this case that he will revive and flourish again. Sometimes the Lord permits those whom he loves to wander from him for a season, and when his time comes to heal their backslidings, they walk more humbly, thankfully, and fruitfully afterwards, from a sense of his abounding mercy, and the knowledge they have by experience acquired of the deceitfulness and ingratitude of their hearts. I hope and pray, he says, it will be so with him. However, these things for the present are grievous, and usually before the Lord heals such breaches, he makes his people sensible that it is an evil and bitter thing to forsake him when he led them by the way. So there Newton is talking not about physical struggles and sorrows, not sicknesses, but what about even the seasons when a believer is apparently drifting and you don't doubt necessarily that they really do belong to Christ, but you see the damage that's being done and it grieves you. Newton goes on to speak about the city of London, where I believe this man he's mentioned lives. And Newton, I told you, was a pastor in the little country village of Olney. And it's funny to hear what Newton says here, because Newton does not realize that after a few years in Olney, I think it was 15 years total, and he's been there about 5 years by the time he writes this letter. So in about 10 years, Newton will no longer be in Olney. He will be pastoring at St. Mary Woolnoth, a very wealthy church right in the heart of London. And he stays there as a pastor for 28 years. But not knowing that, Newton describes London, and he says London is like a spiritual ocean that is angry, and it's always storming, and it's tossing believers left and right. And Newton says that if there's a believer in London that's really walking with the Lord, that's avoiding the distractions that the capital city provides, that's not falling under the grip of any particular sin, and that it's a person that's not, despairing He said, that grace is extraordinary grace. That's quite a believer. But he describes what he calls London grace. But as I mentioned, one type of London grace he describes is a very mature believer, but one is not. It appears to be mature, but Newton is concerned that it's shallow or counterfeit. Here's how he says it. By London grace, when genuine, I understand grace in a very advanced degree. The favored few who are kept alive to God, simple-hearted, spiritually minded. I mean, especially in genteel life. So especially if you're very wealthy and you're in the city and you're still not distracted. He says, in the midst of such snares and temptations, these appear to me to be the first-rate Christians in the land. I adore the power of the Lord in them and compare them to the young men who walk unhurt in the midst of the fire. But in another sense, the phrase London grace conveys no great idea to me. I think there is no place in the kingdom where a person may set up for a professor upon a smaller stock. That's an old way of saying there's nowhere easier to appear to be a Christian and have less of the reality, less stock, less substance. He goes on to explain this. He says, if people can abstain from open immoralities, if they will fly to all parts of the city to hear sermons, if they can talk about the doctrines of the gospel, if they have something to say upon that useless question, who's the best preacher? If they can attain to a speaking acquaintance with someone of an acknowledged character. In other words, they can name drop. They've met this famous preacher. They've talked with him. Then they expect to pass muster. I am afraid there are many who, upon no better evidences than these, deceive both themselves and others for a course of many years. And so Newton is not impressed with what he calls London grace. He says, as I mentioned, that London's like this great tossing, stirring, raging ocean. And he describes himself in the little village of Olney as a man who is safe from the storm. He says, I feel like a man who's standing on a cliff looking at the storming ocean, and I wrap around myself the comfort of knowing that I don't pastor in London. I pastor in a little village. And then, as I mentioned, within 10 years, he would begin a 28-year pastorate in that city. He ends the letter on a more encouraging note, and I want to read that as we close. He says, my soul is kept alive, as it were, by miracle. I feel much inward warfare. The enemy thrusts sore at me that I may fall. And I have abundant experience of the evil and deceitfulness of my heart. But the Lord is gracious, and in the midst of all conflicts, I have a peace springing from the knowledge of his power and grace, and a consideration that I have been helped to commit myself to him. So many wonderful things to consider. If you want to look at the letter, you can see a link in the show notes below, and you can find that letter number 4 to Mrs. So-and-so, dealing with how to trust God in seasons of illness and why are they even necessary. Next week, we'll look at a 5th letter in which he continues on, but goes further with these things and gives more helpful counsel.